How was the slap? Need another one? The words dripped with arrogance, echoing through the cabin like a challenge. She wasn't just a passenger. She was the CEO, the very owner of the jet. Yet in that moment, prejudice blinded the crew to her power, her success, her worth. Humiliation burned hotter than the sting on her cheek. But what the flight attendant believed was dominance was nothing more than the calm before a storm. Because in just 10 minutes, the woman she tried to disgrace would remind everyone exactly who truly belonged. For Maya Washington, life was a testament to resilience. The daughter of a factory worker and a school teacher, she had clawed her way through boardrooms that weren't built for women like her, let alone black women. By 35, she wasn't just successful, she was a CEO with her own private jet, proof that the glass ceiling could be shattered. On that morning, the sky was calm, the engines hummed steady, and the crew moved with routine precision. To Maya, it felt like any other flight. But beneath the polished smiles and polite gestures, a storm was quietly brewing. She didn't know it yet, but respect would soon be replaced by something far more sinister. The first sign was subtle, almost easy to dismiss. A flight attendant's eyes lingered a little too long on Maya, scanning her with a look that wasn't curiosity, but judgment. She'd seen it before. The quick assumptions, the silent calculations of whether she belonged, but she brushed it aside. After all, she was on her own jet. What could possibly go wrong? It started with whispers. Quiet remarks exchanged between the attendants as they moved through the aisle, their voices low but sharp enough to cut. One handed her a glass of water with a forced smile, the kind that hid disdain beneath polished manners. Another adjusted. Her tone speaking to Maya as though she were an unwelcome guest, not the owner of the aircraft. Each moment was small, but together they carried the weight of something bigger, a prejudice that refused to stay hidden. Maya sat back, trying to, focus on her laptop, but the atmosphere was shifting. The glances grew bolder, the smiles tighter, the energy colder. And then came the moment that shattered the thin veil of professionalism. A flight attendant leaned over, making a careless, biting remark about knowing her place. Maya froze, the words hanging in the air like smoke. She had heard phrases like that her whole life, always dressed up as jokes or innocent slips. But here, on her jet, it felt like a direct challenge, a test of whether she would accept the disrespect or confront it head-on. She decided to remain composed. Years of leadership had taught her the power of restraint, but the restraint was not returned. As Maya rose to stretch her legs, the attendant stepped into her path, dismissing her with a wave of the hand as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience. And then, in a moment so shocking it stole the breath from the cabin, the woman struck her. A slap, quick and sharp, echoing in the narrow space like a gunshot. Silence followed. The hum of the engines was suddenly deafening. Maya stood still, her cheek burning, her heart pounding, not just from the sting of the slap, but from the weight of everything it symbolized. It wasn't just one woman's act of disrespect. It was centuries of bias and discrimination condensed into a single, reckless gesture. The attendants shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding her eyes, others watching with a kind of morbid curiosity. But Maya didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't retreat. She sat back down, steadying her breath, her silence louder than any words. Because she knew something the others didn't. She knew this story was far from over. The flight attendant believed she had humiliated Maya, reduced her to nothing more than a target. But the truth was far more dangerous. At 30,000 feet, power didn't belong to the loudest voice or the boldest insult. It belonged to the one who owned the ground beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. And in 10 minutes, the balance of power on that jet would shift in a way none of them were prepared for. The sting of the slap still burned on Maya's cheek, but the deeper wound was invisible. Every eye in the cabin had witnessed it. Yet no one moved. No apology, no outrage, just silence, an accomplice to humiliation. The very crew she had trusted to represent her brand now stood complicit in stripping her dignity. The attendant who struck her stood tall, chest heaving, a smirk threatening at the corners of her mouth as if she had proven a point. To her, Maya was not a CEO, not an owner, not a leader, just another black woman to belittle, to control, to put back in her place. For a heartbeat, Maya's breath faltered. The memories rushed back, boardrooms where her ideas were stolen, interviews where her name was doubted, moments when her presence alone was treated as a threat. This was no different. It wasn't just a slap. It was a declaration that, no matter how high she climbed, prejudice would try to pull her down. But then, something shifted. Maya's silence broke, not with a scream, but with authority. She stood, her presence filling the narrow cabin, her eyes steady and unflinching. In that moment, she was not just a passenger. She was the woman who had built the empire, paid for the very walls around them, and written the checks that fed their families. The attendants' smirks faltered. They exchanged nervous glances, realizing too late the gravity of what had just unfolded. This was no ordinary passenger they could dismiss or silence. This was the one person on that jet who held the power to decide their futures. The engines roared beneath their feet, the cabin trembling as if the plane itself felt the weight of what had just happened. And then, with a calmness that carried more power than rage ever could, Maya prepared to act. Because in minutes, this flight would no longer be remembered for its humiliation. It would be remembered for the justice that followed. The cabin had grown tense, every second stretching under the weight of what had just happened. And then Maya made her move. With measured calm, she reminded the crew of a truth they had forgotten. This was her plane, her company, her rules. In less than 10 minutes, the attendants who had mocked and humiliated her were no longer employees. They were passengers on their final flight. Their arrogance had cost them everything. But for Maya, the victory was bittersweet. She hadn't asked for this confrontation. She hadn't boarded that jet seeking revenge or power. All she wanted was the respect every human being deserves. Instead, she was forced once again to prove her worth in a world too quick to strip it away. As the plane cut through the sky, Maya sat in silence, her cheeks still aching but her spirit unbroken. She knew her story was not just her own. It was part of a much larger truth. A truth about how easily dignity can be denied, how quickly bias can surface, and how even at the heights of success, racism still tries to drag people down. What happened on that flight was more than an insult. It was a reminder. A reminder that power means nothing if silence protects prejudice. A reminder that no achievement makes you immune to injustice. And a reminder that standing up, even in the face of humiliation, is how change begins. Because Maya's story is not just her story. It echoes the struggles of countless others who have been told they don't belong, no matter how hard they've worked, no matter how much they've achieved. The question is, how many more stories like this will we hear before respect stops being a privilege and finally becomes a right?